Imagine for a moment being in Jesus' shoes that morning. The Pharisees and scribes, those religious leaders who considered themselves the guardians of the law, had designed what they believed was the perfect trap. It was during the Feast of Tabernacles, and Jesus was teaching in the temple when suddenly they burst in with a woman. The situation was calculated to the millimeter. These men were experts in Mosaic law. They knew every letter, every comma of the scriptures. They knew exactly what they were doing when they dragged that woman to where Jesus was. "Teacher," they said with that false reverence that characterized their hypocrisy, "this woman has been caught in the very act of adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women to death. So what do you say we should do with her? What is your sentence?"
Yet Jesus refused the script entirely, refusing to play the role they had assigned him in their carefully rehearsed drama.
In a move that must have felt like a thunderclap of silence amid the rising clamor of accusation, he bent low and began tracing words in the temple dust with his finger, John 8:6, the gesture deliberate, unhurried, almost regal in its calm. The Pharisees repeated their demand, voices sharpening with impatience, their certainty beginning to fray at the edges as the silence stretched, but Jesus continued writing as if the clamor were distant thunder rolling over the Judean hills, as if the fate of empires and the judgment of souls were matters too weighty to be rushed by human urgency.
Then, rising to his full height with the quiet authority of one who needs no stage to command attention, he spoke a single sentence that detonated their entire construct like a carefully placed charge beneath a fortress wall. "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her," John 8:7. And then deliberately, devastatingly, with the precision of a surgeon closing an incision, he stooped again and resumed writing. John chapter 8:8. The repetition was no afterthought, no mere flourish. It was the second movement of a symphony composed in dust and silence. The first inscription had been prologue, a silent overture that thickened the air with unspoken judgment, a pause that forced every onlooker to hold their breath and wonder what verdict was being spelled out, letter by letter, in the sacred earth.
The second was the crescendo, the moment when prophecy, conscience, and divine authority converged to unravel the accusers thread by thread, their robes of righteousness suddenly feeling like shrouds. One by one they departed, beginning with the gray-bearded elders whose scholarly pride now crumbled beneath the weight of self-knowledge, their footsteps heavy with the accumulated sins of decades spent policing others while neglecting their own hearts, until the courtyard held only Jesus, the woman standing silently in the center, and the lingering echo of mercy that had replaced the expected clamor of condemnation, John 8:9. What could possibly have been written in that transient medium to produce such a seismic reversal, to transform a tribunal of judgment into a sanctuary of grace? The answer is not found in fanciful speculation or sensational conjecture, but in the seamless integration of prophetic tradition, cultural symbolism, and moral jujitsu that only the Word made flesh could execute with such economy and power, turning the accuser's own weapons against them and revealing the bankruptcy of a righteousness built on external compliance rather than internal transformation. Before we decipher the writing itself, we must first dismantle the facade of righteousness. The Pharisees erected for their accusation was riddled with contradictions, so glaring, so foundational that they betray the entire episode as a stage provocation rather than a genuine quest for justice, a performance designed not to uphold the law but to weaponize it against a perceived threat to their authority. Begin with the statute they wielded like a battle axe with such theatrical solemnity. Leviticus 20:10 is crystal clear, its language, unambiguous and symmetrical. If a man commits adultery with the wife of his neighbor, both the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death. The symmetry is absolute, equal guilt, equal consequence, equal presence required at trial. No exceptions, no loopholes, no selective enforcement. Yet only the woman stood trembling before the assembly, her face flushed with shame, her eyes likely fixed on the ground, her body language speaking volumes of terror and resignation. Where was the man? The Pharisees insisted they had caught her in the very act, a claim that demands immediacy and duality, a snapshot frozen in time that should have captured both participants in flagrante delicto. Adultery is not a solitary vice. It is a transaction, a mutual transgression that requires two willing parties. If the accusers genuinely interrupted the crime mid-committal, the male participant should have been seized alongside her, his tunic askew, his guilt equally undeniable, his presence required by the very law they quoted. His absence is not a footnote. It is a fatal fracture in their case, a violation so blatant that it renders the entire proceeding illegitimate from the outset. Mosaic procedure mandated that both parties appear before the court. Unilateral prosecution violated due process and rendered any verdict null and void under the very system they claimed to defend. By presenting only the woman, these supposed defenders of holiness trampled the very foundation they claimed to uphold, revealing their selective outrage as a tool of convenience rather than a commitment to justice. The logistics grow murkier, still raising questions that hang in the air like smoke from a sacrificial fire. How does a cadre of temple officials, men whose days were spent in ritual purity and scriptural disputation, come to witness a bedroom transgression in real time? Were they conducting midnight raids through the sleeping quarters of Jerusalem? Had they stationed spies in private homes lurking in shadows to catch sinners in the act? Ancient sources outside the canon whisper that the entire scenario may have been engineered. Perhaps the woman was lured into the situation. Perhaps the man was complicit or conveniently absent. Perhaps the entire encounter was orchestrated with the precision of a military operation, all to manufacture a crisis tailored to Jesus' presence in the temple that morning.
Her treatment was barbaric. A public spectacle of degradation, dragged half-naked through Jerusalem's narrow, winding streets, thrust into the temple's glare before thousands of festival pilgrims. Her body and soul offered up as bait in a theological fishing expedition designed to hook one man and one man only. And throughout the ordeal, the gospel records not one syllable from her lips, not a plea for mercy, not a protest against the patent injustice of the missing partner, not even a whisper of defense. Her silence is a scream, a tragic indictment of a society that reduced women to objects in male power games. Their voices erased long before any stone was lifted. Their humanity collateral damage in the war for religious dominance. The trap's brilliance lay in its exploitation of the razor-thin fault line between Jewish religious prerogative and Roman imperial dominion, a fault line that had trembled beneath Judea for decades and would soon fracture entirely in the revolt of 6670 CE. Judea in the 1st century was a province under occupation, its autonomy a carefully negotiated fiction maintained through a delicate dance of compromise and coercion. The Sanhedrin could adjudicate Sabbath violations, dietary laws, temple purity, even certain civil disputes, but the power of the sword, the ius gladii, belonged to Rome alone, a jealously guarded privilege that reminded every Jewish leader of their subjugation. The crucifixion narrative itself would later dramatize this dynamic in stark detail. The chief priests, for all their influence, had to maneuver Pilate into pronouncing sentence because they lacked legal authority to execute on their own, their hands tied by the very empire they resented. The Pharisees understood this calculus intimately, had lived it every day since Pompey's legions marched into the temple in 63 BCE. By forcing Jesus to render a capital verdict in public, they engineered a collision course with inevitable consequences. Affirm the stoning, and he becomes a seditionist, a direct threat to the Pax Romana. The Romans would crush him before the festival ended, and the Pharisees would wash their hands of the matter while claiming to have protected Jewish law. Deny the stoning, and he becomes a heretic. The crowds would stone him themselves in righteous fury, and the Pharisees would stand validated as the true guardians of Moses. The setting magnified the peril exponentially. Sukkot was not merely a harvest festival. It was the pinnacle of the Jewish liturgical year, a week-long explosion of joy that drew tens of thousands to Jerusalem from every corner of the Mediterranean world. Galileans with their rough accents, Idumeans with their fierce loyalty, diaspora. Jews from Parthia to Rome bearing gifts and stories of far-off synagogues.
Pilgrims erected flimsy booths along every alley and rooftop, reenacting the wilderness wanderings, singing Hallel psalms until their voices gave out, dancing under the stars with lulav and etrog in hand. The temple courts were a sea of humanity, a living mosaic of Israel restored, and any controversy here would spread like wildfire through dry stubble, carried on the lips of pilgrims returning home. The Pharisees had chosen their battlefield with military precision, confident that public opinion would deliver the coup de grace their own hands could not.
What they failed to factor into their equation was the nature of their adversary. They were not sparring with a Galilean upstart. They were confronting the eternal Logos who had thundered the Decalogue from Sinai's summit, the one who had watched Moses tremble before the burning bush, the one who had inscribed the first tablets with his own finger. The irony is exquisite, almost unbearable, wielding the Torah to ensnare the Torah's divine author. It was as if a sculptor were baffled by the chisel marks on his own statue, as if a playwright were confounded by quotations from his own script, as if the created were attempting to outmaneuver the creator using the very tools he had given them.
The act of writing on the ground was a symphony of symbolism, conducted in utter silence, each stroke of the finger a note in a composition that resonated across centuries of sacred history. In Jewish culture, inscription was never casual. It was an act of covenantal weight, a declaration that carried the gravity of divine encounter. The rabbis taught through parable gesture and visual metaphor. Every motion carried exegetical freight, every silence a sermon. When Jesus stooped, he assumed a posture at once humble and authoritative. Teachers often crouched to draw disciples into intimate discourse, creating a circle of focused attention where truth could be whispered into willing ears. But the medium was electrifying, chosen with the precision of a poet selecting the perfect word. He wrote not on parchment, not on wax, not even on the stone slabs beneath the dust, but in the loose earth of the temple courtyard itself, the same soil trodden by prophets and priests for centuries. Dust is the ultimate emblem of transience. A gust of wind, the brush of a sandal, and the message vanishes as if it had never been. Yet this very impermanence proclaimed volumes, speaking to the fleeting nature of human judgment and the enduring reality of divine mercy. The instrument. His finger resonated with the only other scriptural instances of direct divine calligraphy. The tablets of the covenant etched by God's finger on Sinai, Exodus 31:18, a moment when the eternal law was made tangible in stone, and the cryptic warning on Belshazzar's palace wall. Daniel 5, when the finger of God wrote judgment against a kingdom that had forgotten its place. Jesus was signaling unbroken continuity with the God who writes history, who inscribes destinies, who speaks through earth and fire and flesh. The location intensified the claim beyond measure. This was the temple, the nexus of heaven and earth. The place where the Shekinah glory had once dwelt in cloud and fire, where sacrifices ascended daily, where the priesthood mediated between God and man. To inscribe anything on that ground was to assert dominion over Israel's holiest space, to claim authority where only the high priest dared tread on the Day of Atonement. The double writing was choreographed brilliance, a two-act drama played out in dust. The first inscription, delivered in silence, functioned as a rabbinic pause, a suspended cord that compelled the assembly to lean forward, to search their own souls, to wonder what verdict was being spelled out letter by letter in the sacred earth. Each stroke a question mark hovering over their own righteousness. The second, following the verbal challenge, was the resolution, the moment when the prophetic word became flesh in the dust, when the accusers saw their own names reflected back at them in the mirror of divine scrutiny. John's careful notation that Jesus wrote as though he did not hear them was not indifference, but strategic transcendence. He refused to dignify hypocrisy with immediate rebuttal, forcing the accusers to stew in the discomfort of their own question, to feel the weight of their own words echoing in the silence. The interpretive fulcrum that unlocks the writing's power is found 6 centuries earlier in the prophet Jeremiah's oracle against a complacent Jerusalem that had grown fat on ritual while starving for righteousness. Lord, you are the hope of Israel. All who forsake you will be put to shame. Those who turn away from you will be written in the dust, because they have forsaken the Lord, the spring of living water. Jeremiah 17:13. In Jewish thought, to be written in the dust was to be erased from the book of life, a verdict of spiritual nullity, a name blotted out from the roll of the covenant people. The phrase was not mere poetic flourish. It carried the weight of divine exclusion, the opposite of being inscribed in the heavenly ledger that guaranteed eternal remembrance. Mere days before this confrontation, during the water libation ceremony at Sukkot's climax, Jesus had stood amid the golden pitchers and trumpet blasts and proclaimed with a voice that cut through the festival din, "Let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink. Whoever believes in me, as Scripture has said, rivers of living water will flow from within them." John chapter 7:37-38. He was declaring himself the antitype of the wilderness rock that Moses struck, the fulfillment of every thirst motif in Israel's story, from Hagar's desperate search in the desert to the psalmist's cry that his soul thirsted for God like a deer for water. The Pharisees rejected the claim as megalomania, as blasphemy of the highest order, a man daring to place himself at the center of Israel's sacred narrative. In doing so, they stepped directly into Jeremiah's crosshairs, those who spurn the true fountain, who turn away from the source of living water. Merit inscription in dust, their names destined for erasure.
Jesus' writing was therefore a prophetic mime, a silent enactment of the curse they themselves had invoked by their rejection. A visual sermon that required no words, because the scripture they knew by heart supplied the commentary. The connection was not obscure. Jeremiah's words were recited during the festival's liturgical cycle, part of the Haftarot that accompanied the Torah readings. The Pharisees, masters of the text, could not plead ignorance. Their retreat was not mere embarrassment, but theological capitulation. The scripture they had weaponized had turned on its handlers, revealing their rejection of the Messiah as the fulfillment of the very prophecy they cherished. When Jesus stooped the second time, the writing likely became personal, shifting from general prophetic allusion to specific piercing indictment. The most coherent reconstruction anchored firmly in Jeremiah's imagery, and the accuser's visceral reaction is that he inscribed their names not as tabloid exposé or public humiliation, but as entries in a divine ledger that pronounce their spiritual obsolescence. In ancient Near Eastern cognition, to write a name in dust was to pronounce it void, to cancel it from the roll of the righteous, to declare it as transient as the medium itself. Each man, peering down through the haze of his own self-righteousness, saw his identity tethered to the prophecy he had memorized since youth, saw his name linked inexorably to the phrase written in the dust, saw the hollowness of a lifetime spent polishing externals while the heart festered beneath. The elders departed first, their decades of accumulated compromises, perhaps secret sins, perhaps the quiet arrogance of power, perhaps the slow erosion of compassion under the grind of legalism, suddenly unbearable in the light of divine scrutiny. The younger followed their bravado, deflating like a punctured wineskin, their youthful certainty crumbling before the reality that no one, not even the most zealous, stands blameless before the Holy One. But the sequence was more than psychological. It was theological recognition. The elders were the most scripturally literate, the ones who had spent lifetimes parsing the prophets. They recognized the remez, the rabbinic hint, at once. To see one's name beside written in the dust was to confront the abyss, to realize that their rejection of Jesus as the living water had fulfilled the very curse they had studied. Later traditions embellish the scene with lists of secret sins scrawled beside each name: adultery, theft, pride. But such flourishes are superfluous and risk reducing divine judgment to petty gossip. The prophetic context alone sufficed. The Holy Spirit needed no footnotes to convict, no sensationalism to drive the point home. Jesus' restraint was masterful, almost unbearably poignant. He did not broadcast shame from the temple balcony, did not summon the crowd to witness their leader's downfall. He let the word they had weaponized perform the autopsy on their souls, let the dust bear witness to their transience. The accusers who came to judge became the judged, their trap transmuted into a mirror that reflected not the woman's sin, but their own.
The Feast of Tabernacles supplied a multi-layered stage for this divine theater, its rituals and symbols forming a rich tapestry that Jesus wove into his response with the skill of a master artist. For 7 days, Jerusalem became a city of fragile huts, palm branches, citron, myrtle, willow erected in courtyards on rooftops along every available space, a living reminder that human dwellings are temporary, that the only permanent home is in God's presence. Pilgrims ate, slept, and celebrated in these sukkot, reenacting the wilderness years when Israel depended entirely on manna and cloud and fire. Each dawn, priests descended to the pool of Siloam, filled golden vessels with water drawn from the living spring, and processed upward amid choirs singing the psalms of ascent and shofar blasts that echoed off the temple walls. The water was poured over the altar in a shimmering cascade, a plea for rain in the coming season, and a symbol of spiritual effusion of the pouring out of God's Spirit on his people. It was at this ceremony's zenith, as the final libation of the festival was offered, that Jesus issued his invitation, positioning himself as the true Siloam, the source from which living water would never run dry. The Pharisees' rejection the next morning as they hauled the woman forward enacted a grotesque parody encircled by symbols of dependence and transience. They asserted self-sufficiency. Immersed in rituals of water and renewal, they spurned the source who stood before them. When Jesus wrote their names in dust, he harmonized with the booths around them. Human righteousness, however ornate, however publicly displayed, is as ephemeral as foliage in autumn, as temporary as the festival structures that would be dismantled in a week. The liturgy included Isaiah's wells of salvation and portions of Jeremiah, including the very passage about the fountain of living water. The Pharisees had chanted the text now indicting them, had studied them in their academies, had taught them to their students. God's choreography was flawless. The confrontation not random but woven into the fabric of redemptive history with threads of prophecy, symbolism, and divine irony. The spoken thunderbolt. "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her," accomplished a triple feat of genius in 17 Greek words. First, it upheld the Torah while exposing its perversion. Deuteronomy 17:7 demanded that witnesses initiate the stoning, but only if they themselves were blameless in the same offense. The Pharisees had ignored this safeguard selectively, enforcing only the punitive clause while bypassing the qualification of executors. Jesus simply restored the full context they had conveniently omitted. Second, it inverted the entire trial. The woman's guilt, once the centerpiece, became secondary to the accuser's moral qualification to judge. The question shifted from, "Does she deserve death?" to, "Do you qualify to deliver it?" Third, it democratized depravity. No hierarchy of righteousness exists. All stand equally condemned before the Holy One, and equally in need of the mercy they were so quick to deny others. Jesus neither incited rebellion against Rome, nor annulled the Mosaic Code. He elevated the issue to a plane where only divine mercy operates, where human authority collapses under its own contradictions. The Pharisees, architects of legal precision, were undone by their own omissions, their trap sprung on themselves. Jesus deployed rabbinic tools with divine authority that left his opponents breathless. He employed remez, the art of scriptural hint, by enacting Jeremiah without quoting it, trusting the erudite to connect the dots. Silence, a classic pedagogical tool, built suspense and forced introspection. The Cal-Weichamer argument from lesser to greater was implicit. If you cannot maintain personal purity, the lesser, how dare you administer divine justice, the greater? His declaration functioned as a rhetorical question, another rabbinic staple. Yet where other teachers cited Hillel or Shammai or Gamaliel, Jesus spoke as the source. The origin, the author. The dust became a blackboard for eternity. The temple courtyard, a classroom where the lawgiver taught the lawyers the true meaning of the law they thought they owned. The lessons radiate across millennia. Sin is the great equalizer. No one stands on a pedestal of self-righteousness. Religious systems are perpetually tempted to prioritize external compliance over internal transformation. When faith becomes a badge of superiority rather than a cry for mercy, it breeds modern Pharisees. Justice without redemption is incomplete. Punishment must aim at restoration, not mere retribution. Grace is not permissiveness. Go and sin no more couples absolution with expectation, freedom with responsibility. The vulnerable must be protected, not exploited. Jesus consistently sided with the marginalized against institutional power. Human judgments are as transient as dust inscriptions, while divine forgiveness echoes eternally. Only Christ, sinless, sovereign, and merciful, can perfectly balance truth and grace. When stones form in our fists, may we see our names in the dust and choose the hand that writes redemption in the ledger of grace.